This paper deals with the Paleologan verse romances. I wish to outline arguments for a radical reassessment of the circumstances of their composition. I think these romances are getting a lot of work out this evening. The Paleologan romances share several characteristics. Two are problematic. First, they employ a register of Greek that uses more of the vernacular than was normally allowed. Second, they use the unrhymed 15-syllable verse, which was not accorded any literary merit by most Byzantine writers. Other characteristics are less problematic. The love and adventures of the central couple take place in courtly environments in which elaborate castles and gardens are prominent. The environment includes Frankish as well as Greek elements. Several issues are regularly discussed. One concerns the romance's date, which is significant since a context shapes a reader's response. The assumption that these texts were written after 1204 has long been accepted, but the detail of their dating is still debated. This affects each romance's relations with the other. There is debate over the sequence of composition. They share plot motifs, most notably the elaborate gardens and castles. Also discussed is their style, which involves many repeated phrases, both within any one text and across the group as a whole. Interpretation of these repetitions was much discussed in the 1970s and 1980s. The fluid nature of the romance's transmission poses difficult editorial problems, so there is not yet a consensus over editorial methodologies. Another debating point concerns the nature of the love relationship. Is more owed to Western medieval imports than to long-standing Greek literary conventions. Attention is sometimes paid to where the romances may have been composed, with suggestions including areas of mixed Franco-Greek settlement after 1204, such as the Morea, but also Byzantine centres such as Nicaea and Constantinople. However, other issues are just as regularly ignored. Thus, only very general reasons are suggested for the appearance of these texts, often explained as Byzantine society opening up to influences from the West after the Fourth Crusade, and Byzantine literary traditions coming under pressure. Apart from the Jeffreys proposals in connection with the background of oral poetry, there is little discussion why these texts should use the 15-syllable line, why they use a form of vernacular Greek, or why they are anonymous. Two new factors have come into play recently. First, a good edition of Livistros and Rhodamni by Panagiotis Agapitos was published in 2006. Tina, I know about your edition too. But no, it's a good one. But Panagiotis' edition has clarified a number of issues. And second, in a paper published in 2002, attention has been drawn by Mary Lyon Dolezal and Maria Mavroudi to Theodore Itakinos' homily on St. Anne, which includes a striking ekphrasis of a garden with features that are relevant to my argument. First, let us deal with Itakinos. He was a teacher who worked in Constantinople from the late 1290s until at least 1327. His pupils included the sons of some of the most prominent political and ecclesiastical figures of the age, such as the Mezazon Theodore Metochitis and the future patriarch John Glikis. Itakinos' writings include imperial encomia and monodies, as well as the homily on St. Anne. What is striking about the garden ekphrasis, which forms a considerable portion of that homily, is that Dolezal and Mavroudi found the best literary analogies in the Paleologan verse romances, specifically Livistros and Rhodamni, Velfandros and Chrysanza, Callimachos and Chrysoroi, and the Achilleis. We do not know precisely when the homily was written, but these motifs suggest that the romances were well known to Itakinos before 1327, the last date for which there is evidence for his activity. Panagiotis Agapitos has argued that the romances certainly existed as a genre by 1330. Itakinos' homily confirms this, as well as hinting that the date can be pushed earlier. This fits with the probable dating of the nephew of Michael VIII, and fitting with Andronikos Paleologos, who is the most likely author of Callimachos and who seems to have died after 1310. His background would have matched that of the pupils of Itakinos, and it would have been through a teacher like this that he would have acquired competence in Byzantine Greek. The ekphrasis that are the basis for the garden descriptions in Itakinos' homily on St. Anne and in the Drakondokastron of Kallimykos, for example, probably began as classroom exercises as progymnasmata. Second, the evidence that the Paleologan romances were in existence by 1330. The argument put forward by Agapitos is based on the colophon in Leipzig Graicus 35, a manuscript of Logos Paragiritikos Peristikias and Eftikias, which is part of the Romance network. And this manuscript is now dated by its watermark, thanks to Maria Politi, to 1354 to 1374. Agapitos points out that the non-scribal nature of the colophon demonstrates that there existed a previous copy of this manuscript, which he puts to circa 1330, though that's a somewhat arbitrary date. He also argues that the composition of Livistros should be placed in the Lascarid court in Nicaea, which came to an end in 1261. His main reasons are the romance's literary sophistication and its courtly atmosphere, which includes a shield-raising ritual like that revived for the coronation in 1254 for Theodore II Lascaris, although this ritual was repeated several times in the following century. Agapitos also points out that the 12th century Comnenian novels are found in the 13th century compendia produced as part of the Lascarid intellectual regrouping after 1204, manuscripts such as Marcianus Graicus 524 or Barocci 131. The Comnenian novels, one of which also includes a shield-raising episode, are undoubtedly reflected in the Paleologan romances. There is another text which came fully into the public domain in 1996, but which has been almost entirely overlooked. This is The War of Troy, or Polomostis Thrados, which tells of the sieges of Troy, its sack, and the slow return of the invading Greeks to their homeland. Huge, and with its many manuscripts making a large proportion of surviving lines in this literary genre, it shares the romance's characteristics. It is in the 15-syllable line, it has repeated phrases and a fluid textual tradition, and uses a form of the vernacular. It does not have garden descriptions, but it does have lavish ekphrasis of fantastic objects and buildings. There are probably several reasons for the neglect, its length, its belated publication, and a perception that the subject is war and not love, so it cannot be a romance. But this is not the case. There are twin themes, war and love. Love is the trigger for the wars. Initially, there were two abductions, first of Visione and then of Helen, though these are not presented in terms of personal emotion. But there are three key relationships which are explored extensively in terms of the psychology of love: Jason and Medea, the Diomedes, Briseida and Troilus triangle, and Achilles' entanglement with Polyxene. The episodes involving these figures use amatory vocabulary and analyse the protagonist's sensibilities at length. The War of Troy is a translation of Benoît de Saint-Maur's Roman de Troie. It is certainly more a translation than a paraphrase, though some elements have been consistently abbreviated, particularly in battle scenes. The Roman de Troie, with its emphasis on the relationships between men and women as much as on heroic warriors, was a significant text in the development of literature in French in the 12th century. It was a transitional text between the martial world of the chanson de geste towards the personal tensions explored by Chrétien de Troyes in, for example, his Érec et Enide. But the Roman de Troie also conveyed a political message. Working at the court of Henry II Plantagenet, Benoît was writing his patron into the legendary Trojan genealogies of the rulers of Europe. The Dukes of Normandy, Henry's immediate ancestors who had seized the throne of England in 1066, could thus also be ranked as descendants of Priam of Troy, whose offspring were the eponymous ancestors of the dynasties of the medieval West. It was these political overtones to the Roman de Troie which have led to earlier suggestions that the Frankish Morea was a likely place for the production of the War of Troy. The War of Troy has never been given a satisfactory date. The date of circa 1350 suggested in the 1996 edition was based on the need to place the War of Troy somewhere in the period that produced the Paleologan romances. The middle years of the 14th century, when Catherine de Valois, representative of the Angevin overlord of the Morea, and her chancellor, Niccolo Acciaiuolo, with his literary interests, when they were present in the Peloponnese, seemed to provide a moment which had an incentive to produce a work of this nature and kind, and she was there in 1348 for 2 years. However, as a result of recent work on the manuscripts of Benoît, it is tempting to float a radically different hypothesis. it seems to me that a case can be made that the War of Troy was translated from Benoît de Saint-Maur's Roman de Troyes in the Morea sometime before 1281 at the prompting of Leonardo de Veroli, Chancellor of the Principality of Achaia. This translation was due to the ideological program of the Frankish ruling class. It is also tempting to suggest that knowledge of this translation stimulated the creation of the other Paleologan romances. The War of Troy is a huge text in its current form. As it has several lacunas, it would originally have been even longer. The creation of a translation of such dimensions must have been the result of a commission from a patron. Furthermore, many copies were made. 7 manuscripts survive, all rather late, in whole or in part, but good arguments demand the existence of at least another 10. The blank spaces and titles in the surviving manuscripts demonstrate that the text which lies behind them was illustrated. The enterprise that produced a text on this scale was major. It would have been surprising if it had been undertaken for any other reason than furtherance of the ideological overtones attached to the Roman de Troyes. This much has already been suggested. It has, however, always been a puzzle that the Greek translation was based on Benoît's verse text from around 1170, which had been superseded in the 13th century by prose reworkings, when it became fashionable to write history in prose rather than verse. Prose versions of Benoît existed independently from the early 13th century, while the Grande Chronique de France in 1275 also made use, in a brief format, of the legendary genealogies of the Trojan descent of the ruling houses of Europe, in this case the ruling house of France. There was also a widely disseminated Latin translation of Benoît by Guido della Colonna, made between 1270 and 1287. Why was not one of these texts chosen for translation from Greek rather than the old-fashioned verse Benoît? Recent work has argued convincingly that in the 1260s, Benoît's verse text, by then nearly a century old, was for the first time given illustrations, and the political overtones already present in the text were stressed in the illustrations. The earliest surviving illustrated manuscript of the Roman de Troyes has a date of 1264 and was arguably made for a member of the French court in Paris in the reign of Louis IX. The earliest illustrated manuscript of the Grande Chronique from 1275 contains images in its opening chapter on Troy which respond to those of the illustrated verse Benoît, pointing to the Trojan descent of the French ruling family. This manuscript of the Grande Chronique was presented to Philip III, younger brother and successor to Louis IX. The use of the Trojan legends as a vehicle for claims of political status resonant in the 12th century thus continued to be valid in the 13th. These ideas were reinforced at the Paris court, whose junior members, notably Charles of Anjou, ruled in the Regno in Naples. Benoît's verse text had been given renewed ideological impact. In 1267, by the Treaty of Viterbo, William Villehardouin, Prince of Achaia, ceded control of the Principality of Achaia in the Morea to the Angevins in Naples in the person of Charles of Anjou, brother of Louis IX of France. Acting on behalf of Villehardouin was his chancellor Leonardo de Veroli, who was deeply involved in both the Angevin court at Naples and the Moreot Principality. Married to Marguerite de Toucy from one of the prominent Franco-Greek families of the Morea, Leonardo was also a close personal friend of Charles of Anjou. Leonardo spent some 17 years resident in the Morea. Famously, in his will on his death, in 1281, he left books, chronicles, text in the French and Italian vernacular, and one book in Greek. In Naples, he had books copied. A cultured and cultivated lawyer, Leonardo would have been aware of the re-emphasized political and literary nuances of the Roman de Troyes, as well as the geographical and historical ironies of his duties in the Principality. He was the agent of a Trojan descendant governing a subject Greek population. If we accept this, then here is an explanation for the use of Benoît's Troyes in its original verse form. However, this suggestion still leaves unanswered the question of why Leonardo chose to have the Roman de Troyes put into 15-syllable verse and near-vernacular Greek. Here, it is relevant to consider the Chronicle of Morea, of which the French prose and Greek verse are the primary versions. Teresa Shawcross has recently reassessed the nature of all the versions, focusing on the French and the Greek. She concludes that both of these show signs of a distant connection with their respective traditions of oral composition, but that the Greek retains the clearer indication of this process. The earliest manuscript, the earliest Greek manuscript, the Copenhagen version, is to be dated circa 1380, and the sole French manuscript, now in Brussels, to the late 14th or early 15th century. On internal evidence, the texts behind these manuscripts will have come into being around the years 1310 to 1320. Shawcross talks of rolling phases of composition and points to the layers of earlier material in the surviving written versions. For many years, Michael and I have argued that the peculiarities of the Chronicle of Morea can be seen as a written reflection of an indigenous type of oral poetry, of a type common to all European and many non-European proto-literatures. Such poetry was only written down in exceptional circumstances, but the stylistic features of its background would leave their mark in later purely written conventions. In the Chronicle of Morea, the most conspicuous signs of the background are the repeated phrases, and also the speech reporting patterns to which Teresa Shawcross has recently drawn our attention. The suggestion then is that when Leonardo de Veroli wanted to have the vernacular French roman de trois put into a register of Greek that would be accessible to the Greeks of Morea, as well as to the mixed-raced communities that had come into existence since 1204, the only comprehensible register open to him would have been in verse of the type to be found in the Chronicle of Morea or in a proto-version of the Chronicle of the Morea. So, considering recent reinterpretations of the manuscripts of the Roman de Trois, a case can be made that the Angevin administration of the Principality of Achaia at some point after 1267, through the Chancellor Leonardo de Veroli, who died in 1281, commissioned an illustrated War of Troy in vernacular Greek verse as an act of cultural imperialism. The text was left anonymous because that was part of the stylistic baggage. It is debatable how the Greek-speaking audience responded to this, but subsequent development suggests that the reading public did react positively to the love stories contained. After the recapture of Constantinople in 1261, Byzantine literary life and Byzantine literary education were re-established. Teachers such as Iertakinos set up in business. Soon after it was written, a copy of the massive text on love and war that had been generated in the Morea would have come to the capital, where there was already an interest in amatory material, chiefly in the novels from late antiquity and the 12th century, both varieties of which are to be found in contemporary manuscripts. And note too that in the 1290s, Maximus Planudes was translating Ovid, the love poet read widely in the Latin Middle Ages. At some point, I suggest, someone from the Constantinopolitan literary circles decided to produce a romantic story of love to rival those embedded in the War of Troy, using the same traditional verse style. But the unmistakable signs of a background in formulaic poetry were mixed in with less obvious markers of learned influence. These may show a Greek and Byzantine reaction to the Frankish coloration of the War of Troy by acknowledging Greek predecessors in both the learned language, such as Macrobolitis Ismini and Isminias, and in lower registers, such as the anonymous Diini Sekritis. This would explain the appearance of Livistros, Velthandros, and Callimachos. The Achilles and other minor texts using Trojan material tend to Hellenize the heroes, but interestingly, without denying them elements of French fashion. In 1983, towards the end of a long-running debate about the style of vernacular verse, a diagram was published which attempted to set out the relationships between the Paleologan romances discussed by Giuseppe Spadaro as plagiaristic borrowings. At the top of the diagram stands the War of Troy. It now seems that what was then an expedient of draftsmanship has produced the truth. That is indeed where the War of Troy should be. It is interesting that phrases from the War of Troy that have been translated directly from the French original have parallels in, for example, Livistros or the Achilles. What is attractive about this argument? and I stress this is an outline argument, is that it explains why the Paleo-Logan romances appeared when they did, and in verse of a particular type and style, and why they were anonymous. They were prompted by emulation of the War of Troy, whose translator had been commissioned to use a particular genre and register of Greek in order to ensure the communication of a propaganda message from the Frankish Angevin overlords of Morea. The message was that the Angevin overlords shared a legendary past with their Greek subjects, a past rooted in the Trojan War. Thank you.